Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Super Dandori Bros Podcast, episode 14. And I am Leighton, and I have with me the super awesome Ryan.
Yeah, I'm where we get the Super and Super Dandori Brothers.
Exactly. I need to come up with a new way to introduce you every time, and I need to not think of it off the top of my head because I just go blank. So I'm going to have to try and add that to my notes next time.
Yeah, you have one list that is potential podcast topics, and then another list that's potential intros.
Yes, exactly. And it's just basically how I bring you into the fray. Today we have a very interesting topic, something that I've kind of been paying attention to a lot, especially with the Switch 2 launch. Well, starting to try and get the launch going. There's been a lot of ups and downs, as we've talked in previous podcasts, and there's just a lot of interesting things. There's one thing that's kind of stood out to me that I really wanted to dive into and kind of see what your thoughts were on this, Ryan, and then hopefully just bring up a few points that maybe the listeners will have some feedback on as well. But the thing, if you've read the title, you know what it's about. But basically, I think that Nintendo is not done with the Switch one. That should be obvious, but I think a lot of people seem to be overlooking this at the moment, especially with the Switch 2 and all the hype. Everyone's just kind of already throwing their Switches out to the trash. They're like, all right, I just need a Switch 2. But if you look at a lot of the evidence, Nintendo clearly isn't super worried about the price and the backlash because they're going to still make money because people are still going to buy the Switch 1 and they're still going to buy Switch 1 games. Do you have any thoughts on that going into this?
No, largely I actually agree with you. I think that people are, upset about the price, and I think, it is, a big jump from the Switch 1. The games obviously are a jump depending on which ones you're looking at. Obviously, there was some misinformation out there in the beginning. Most of that's been cleared up, and the situation isn't quite as bad as we thought it was. Though still, any price jump is going to be felt by the consumer. At the same time, I just feel at the end of the day, people are still going to buy it. I mean, if you look at around the 2008 recession, my understanding is spending on video games actually went up during that time. Mm-hmm. So I actually think that, there are certain products, and maybe it's not the case anymore, but I think it's one of those things where people are going to be upset about it, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of people are going to buy it. Now, some people won't be able to afford it, absolutely. Anecdotally, there are definitely going to be people, but I just think en masse, I think people are still going to go for it. And I think based on what Nintendo said over the past week or so, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think that they are sort of suggesting that they're going to keep the Switch 1 around, but I'd love to hear your entire case.
Yeah, and just to be clear to everyone listening, my goal in this isn't to convince you that this is right or what Nintendo's doing is right with pricing. I mean, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and I think definitely there's some. It's challenging with the pricing, and so I'm not going to pretend that it is a good thing or a bad thing. What I'm looking at trying to look at objectively is evidence that Nintendo is attacking this whole market strategy a little differently than they have in the past, and with this transition. And there's some similarities to things they've done before, but I think this one's slightly different just because the stakes are a bit higher with them being a single console company now versus a dual console company like they used to be. So, and with just the pricing, I think, Nintendo is kind of put into an interesting place. So here's the first thing I want to bring up. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people think about, but the Switch 2 is really for the dedicated fans who are craving more. And Nintendo has held onto the Switch for 8 years, and it's done incredibly well. It still sells an insane amount of games, and there's still a lot of people who are actively using it. According to Nintendo stats, there's still at least 128 million, I believe, people still actively using their Nintendo Switch in 2024, which is pretty amazing considering it's only sold 150 million units. So, I mean, it sold 150, so a majority of people are still turning on their Switch and using it. So that's pretty impressive. That means there's people still playing the games, and I'm one of them. I still use my Switch more than any other system, and now that comes from the fact that it's my primary system. If you have multiple systems, I'm sure other people might be switching over, but there's a lot of people that are single system homes. especially families. And so the Switch is still functional. There's nothing really wrong with it if you're not really pushing graphics and you're not really worried about, the latest and greatest stuff. They're probably wondering why even get a new Switch. The Switch 2 almost seems superfluous to them. So I think that the Switch 2 was kind of out of is necessary because there's, pressure to be like, hey, you got to move on. We got to make better games, better graphics, different features. So what Nintendo's done is they've made this, and they know that the hardcore crowd, the people that are, antsy for the latest games, antsy for the latest graphics, they're what's going to support the Switch 2 for the first couple years. You think about the Switch 1 adoption was pretty consistent throughout its entire lifespan. It wasn't like it sold a lot in the beginning and then slowed down. It stayed consistently selling well. I think the Switch 2 will do the same. It's just going to be a little different. So the Switch 1 is going to be still available through for the first year or two, potentially, at least until probably sometime next year, because of the lineup of games they've already announced for next year. They've already announced 2 brand new games coming next year from Nintendo that are for the Switch 1, which is Rhythm Heaven and Tomodachi Life. So, they still got games even this year, like Pokemon ZA and Metroid Prime 4. Despite having Switch 2 editions, they are still Switch 1 games. I think that this is kind of like my first thought, right? And the whole thing, as far as like, there's, more, I'm trying to clarify myself here, but Nintendo clearly is still trying to support the system. And they kind of did this with the 3DS where they still had games coming out for it, but I think the 3DS died a lot faster because everyone wanted to switch to a new thing. But I think the Switch 1 might hold on a little longer because of just how big the user base is and just how good the system still is. You play those games, they're not that bad. I still play them on my big TV and they still look okay. So what do you think of some of those thoughts, Ryan?
I think largely I agree with you. I think that there are a few things that do differentiate this from the 3DS to Switch transition. One of them being the backwards compatibility, which I think is sort of the most obvious point, is that every game that's being released for Switch 1 is technically a Switch 2 game as well. It just says Switch 1 on the cover, and maybe like graphically it's less impressive than the Switch 2 editions or Switch 2 dedicated games. So I think largely that makes a lot of sense. Looking at Tomodachi Life, like in particular, retrospectively, now that we know more about Game Chat, I think is actually a really interesting choice to sort of not quite end the Switch on, because that's sort of our thesis, is they're not necessarily ending the Switch, but to sort of like demonstrate like, hey, this is like in some ways like a very social game, with friends and whatever, and we have a social experience. And while I'm not particularly familiar with the Tomodachi Life, like the original game, nor am I particularly familiar with this new game, if there are co-op elements, I think that is hypothetically interesting. So in some ways it almost would have maybe not necessarily like directly new features with Switch 2, but it sort of gets enhanced by Game Chat with Switch 2, hypothetically. Again, like, I know very little about the game, but I do recognize it that of everything that they've shown, that is clearly the most social game coming out within the next couple years that we're aware of. I think another thing that hints at this is the game sharing feature, where essentially you can, sort of like we had guessed, like in some ways use the Switch 1 as a Wii U-ish controller for some games. Now, it's not exactly the way that it works, but at the same time, the spirit of it was sort of correct. And I think that this is obviously a much more direct connection between the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 than the 3DS ever had with Switch 1. If anything, it actually is sort of reminiscent of like with GameCube and Game Boy Advance, where like with Four Swords Adventures, you could use the Game Boy Advance as a controller. It's sort of actually in that vein, which is kind of interesting. So instead of having connections between parallel consoles, it's like connections between consoles and series, but you're still keeping the original one running. So I think that anybody who's saying like, okay, this is directly comparable to the 3DS, I think in some ways that's absolutely true, but in some ways I do think that there are critical exceptions that make this transition very uniquely different. One thing that does make me wonder is rumor is that Nintendo has just mass produced and stockpiled Switch 2, as if they were anticipating huge demand. However, Nintendo is a company that also likes to provide a lot of flexibility for itself. And so if it needed to, like you could sort of look at it in a few different ways. Like if they needed to get it on shore very, very quickly because they anticipated maybe future problems or at least wanted to insure against it, that would make some sense. At the same time, if they just expected demand to be really high because they didn't really know about the future, they wanted to be prepared for that. And so like that makes sense. But I guess if their plan the whole time was to keep Switch 1 around as like a legacy console that people will keep buying, like then in that way the large upfront cost of producing all these consoles and shipping them and storing them in like a warehouse makes a little bit less sense. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, they definitely are anticipating huge demand for the Switch 2, and I'm not sure how they get those metrics, and I don't know if those metrics have changed since the price and everything, all the controversy. But I think that overall, like most people, because it says Switch 2, if a mom goes into a store and sees that and the kid says they want it, or they can tell immediately that it's the new version, and someone in the store will probably say, and if they have money, they'll buy it. But, I think there's still a huge anticipation for the Switch 2, and I think that it's one of those systems that once people get in their hands and there's enough people playing it, then more people are going to be like, okay, I'll get it because everybody else is getting it, and it'll just snowball. But they've got to get that initial hype going, and I think Mario Kart can do it. Maybe Donkey Kong can do it. It might have been I'm excited for that game, don't get me wrong, but I think it might have been a bit of a not the best choice to get people hyped for the system, but we'll see. I also like that you brought up game sharing because, yeah, that was a big thing that people seem to ignore, was the fact that they were advertising that you could use a Switch 2 to host Switch 1 games for multiplayer. And I think that's going to be something, I don't know how much we'll see Switch 2 games doing that, and maybe Switch 2 to Switch 2. But because here's the thing, I don't exactly know how that's working, because if people think it's streaming it, I think it could be very similar to how the DS did it, where it literally downloaded content from the other cartridge, just the right amount to play that specific game or that level. It literally is like it's streaming it, but it's literally streaming parts of the game to the system and putting it in RAM. I don't know if that's 100% true or not, but that was how it worked on the DS. You literally were downloading. It was called DS Download because you were downloading the game. So if they do that, that'd be crazy. But it might have to, because there's game sharing online, and I'm like, there's no way you're streaming that from your Switch 2 to like 3 or 4 other systems and all playing off the same Switch. That just seems logistically crazy, with latency and visual fidelity and things like that. So as we saw with Game Chat, and so
what are you talking about? That was the most fluid stream that we've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean,
10 frames per second.
It's pretty rough. I think it could get better with some updates, and obviously, they're trying not to tax the system too hard, so you can still play these games in the fidelity that you want. Playing to play Mario Kart at 4K or 1440p at 60 frames per second while still having game chat going and 3 simultaneous streams. It's kind of impressive that it can do all the above. So that'll be interesting. As far as, and I think here's my thought too, is I think that if they are going to keep selling the Switch 1, it's probably going to be the Switch Lite. I mean, they could sell the other one, but I think the Switch Lite makes the most sense because it's the cheapest one. If they're like, hey, I can't afford a $450 system, but my kid still wants to play Pokemon, and Pokemon is notoriously, holds on to the last generation system till the last minute. So I could see, that just being like, hey, I can buy my kid a $200 Switch Lite, and they can play Pokemon, and they can play Mario, they can play the old Mario Kart, which is still fun. That's going to be like Nintendo's strategy, is to grab the casual audience with the Switch Lite, maybe a Switch OLED or this regular Switch, just so that if, casuals want to play Switch Sports or something, or Ring Fit, but I don't know how those numbers are. But I do think that there's definitely some staying power for the Switch 1 in that regard because of game sharing and the fact that they showed that off. And in NSO, I think people are forgetting that. I mean, at least doesn't seem like Nintendo's planning on shutting that down anytime soon. There's still a ton of things you can do, like all the basically virtual console type games you can do on NSO. I mean, they're adding GameCube for the Switch 2. It doesn't mean they're shutting down all the other systems. If they add another Super Nintendo game to the Switch 2, they're probably going to add it to the Switch 1. So the only thing that's new coming to the Switch 2 is GameCube. So, I mean, I think there's some other features, and I don't know if these updates are going to the Switch 1. I think they're exclusive to Switch 2, but the ability to completely remap the controller for all of them. So you can remap the N64, the GameCube, any of those controllers in the games. Um, and there might have been something else, but yeah. So game sharing was a big one. Switch. Yeah, I talked about Switch 1 games coming, and I'll bet you there's going to be more. And also just like even not first party, like indie games could still come to Switch 1. We forget that Switch 1 games are like, or a lot of indie games aren't super graphics intensive. So why wouldn't you still sell it on the Switch 1 with that giant install base? I mean, Switch 1 is going to be an amazing indie machine probably for the next few years. So we'll see how that goes.
Absolutely. I'd like to transition a little bit now to playing devil's advocate, if
Okay.
that's okay.
Yeah, do it.
So, one of the things that you and I have talked privately about this, that we feel has sort of held the PS5 back, is in some part the fact that a lot of games are releasing for both PS4 and PS5. So I guess, obviously, like so far we haven't seen the same degree of that. So like Mario Kart is Switch 2 exclusive, Donkey Kong Bonanza is Switch 2 exclusive, presumably Kirby Air Riders is Switch 2 exclusive, et cetera, et cetera. However, if they are going to continue supporting Switch 1 and everything is forwards compatible in a way, these are games that are being released for Switch 2 that very similar to the PS4 and PS5, like you could get. Some of them have paid upgrades, like it's starting to sound like pretty similar. So I guess like what do you think? Do you think that they are holding on to enough games for Switch 2 to actually like avoid the fate of the PS5, where the PS5 essentially just feels like redundant and objectively the worst option in terms of like finances and essentially like exclusive games? Because there have been like 7 exclusive games for PlayStation 5. I don't remember the count, but it's something like actually shockingly small.
Yeah, especially since the PlayStation 5 is now approaching 5 years on the market, and they've already released a PlayStation 5 Pro in that time. And it's unfortunate that there are certain games like Assassin's Creed that are very distinctly made for the PlayStation 5 Pro. Like they look drastically different, which is sad. But I think there is something to be said about that. At the moment, it does seem like Nintendo is going to try and cater to the Switch 2, but I think the distinctive difference is going to be the casual versus the core like gamer market. This is why I think Nintendo's going after the core gamers first, because if you look at, I mean, Mario Kart I guess isn't a core gamer game, and I guess neither is Donkey Kong too. It kind of is though, because I don't know how much casuals really care about getting to a 3D Donkey Kong game, but because it's most people are rearing for a 3D Donkey Kong game are the ones who played DK64. And people just really love Donkey Kong. But like people played old school Donkey Kong would probably prefer side scrollers or something like that. But I think that you look at, and obviously Prime 4 is a Switch 2, Switch 1, but I think that's just because of the timing. But you look at the FromSoft game, you look at Dustbloods, and I know that's a third-party game, but it's an exclusive Switch 2 game that I think shows that Nintendo is looking to pull in that core market. Like they're going after some of those games. You got Elden Ring, you got Cyberpunk. So they're kind of bringing those third parties with their core games to kind of draw people in. And Mario Kart again will get some of the casuals, but a lot of the games they're keeping on Switch 1 are casual games. Rhythm Heaven's more of a casual game, and Tomodachi Life is a casual game. Metroid Prime 4 I think is an outlier. I'm not going to really use that in this whole thing because it's been worked on for the Switch 1 for so long. It just kind of had to launch on both, but I don't think they're launching it to gain a casual or hard. I mean, it's definitely probably more of a Switch 2 launch title, or not launch title, sorry, just a Switch 2 title for most people who want that game. I could see Nintendo kind of continuing like casual games on the Switch 1 because I think that's the market that isn't worried about graphics. It's the market that doesn't care about the newest games. It's so they'll kind of keep the casuals happy, but eventually, like once the Switch is like 9 or 10 years old, people are going to say, okay, this thing's getting old, the controls are getting old, and they finally, the trickle down effect where it's finally getting to them that, hey, there's a new Switch. Because we're in the gaming market, we just kind of like, we stay up to date with the news, but most casual people, they don't know, don't care. It's like if someone tells them maybe one day in a conversation or they happen to see it in the store, maybe they'll be like, oh yeah, I'll pick up the Switch 2. Oh, that's kind of cool. And, oh, I see that game. That looks like cool, like new Animal Crossing, or they finally learned there's a new Mario Kart. They might pick it up then. But I think that for the Switch 1 audience, they're going to try and keep, and I don't think this means they're going to move a ton of systems while the Switch 2 is out. I think it's just they're going to keep games coming out and they're going to keep NSO alive. They're going to try and keep all that stuff going. And it's so funny because there's a ton of people I've seen online that because of the price of Switch 2, they're like, yep, I guess I'm holding on to my Switch 1. Like, does that mean you're going to keep playing your Switch 1 and keep buying games for Switch 1 and keep the NSO subscription alive for Switch 1? Or, like, I guess I'm curious, like, what that means for some of these people. But I don't know. It'd be interesting. Yeah, I think the price, though, will, for casual people, the price may draw them to the Switch 1 if they don't really care about the Switch 2. Especially if people are playing in handheld. The thing is, like, it's great. Like, it's kind of hard to play Switch 1 on a newer TV if you don't have a nice, if you have a nice big 4K TV, it's a little rough. But if you're just playing in handheld mode, it doesn't really matter that much. And that's where I guess a lot of people play Switches for handheld. And they buy like a PlayStation or an Xbox or something for, TV.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's certainly possible, though. I think it is also, like, I do think it's actually quite impressive, the specs that they showed specifically for, and I know it's a retro game, so it's, obviously going to, like, be working some magic under the hood, but the fact that Metroid Prime 4 is going to be like 4K 60, is actually, like, kind of crazy. And that, I guess that sort of leads me to my next question is, like, because you essentially are, I think the core of sort of what you're proposing is that because they're going after the that essentially they're trying to do the Wii U but better, in that I remember back when the Wii U was announced, they were like, oh yeah, it's going to have all this third-party support, and look at the graphics, they're so much better, like, whatever. And granted, this time around they actually are, like, much, much better than the Switch 1, but, like, essentially they can keep their casual audience on Switch 1 and then try to capture the core gamers on Switch 2. Do I essentially understand your premise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then I guess, like, my question is, like, if that was in some ways the strategy that they had attempted before, where obviously, like, a ton of the Wii's success was with the casual market, and they sort of lost the core audience with it. And then I remember, at least very early on with Wii U, when they announced it, like, they were trying to at least get some of the core audience back. You look at, like, launch games like Zombie U, for example. That's not a casual game. And so I guess the question is, like, what's going to be different this time around? Like, because it is, like, they both look fairly similar. Obviously the titles are a bit more explicit that this is a successor, but the Wii U looked very similar to the Wii with the exception of the gamepad. And so then what makes it, like, at least communicated to the market? Or, like, what's different with the situation this time around that you feel that Nintendo is, like, going to successfully differentiate these as two different products and be able to capture both sides of this market?
I think there's a lot of different factors in this that make it different. Obviously, you're right. There's certain similarities in this situation with the systems looking the same and having the same name, just with a difference. Obviously, the 2, I think, makes a huge difference over the U moniker that they use for this Wii U, because it definitely indicates that this is a sequel system. One thing I've noticed, too, is that they're pushing very hard on the media aspect of this. So, like, when they had the Direct shortly after that, they had a ton of big press of people. They had a ton of top tier, like, really popular YouTubers demoing the Switch 2, getting the word out that there's a new Switch, and they're talking about it from a much more casual perspective of people who, like, they know tech, but they definitely, like, their core audience is people that might not, know all the techie specs, but they just want to know, like, what is it and what is it, how are the game's fun. So that was huge. But this is, and so also another thing is, well, I mean, if you on the Switch 1, there's, like, a ton of marketing. If you just boot it up, they're, like, putting it in the news, and they're doing it. There's different emails they're putting out, so there's different marketing strategy. But so this is going to be an interesting one. I don't think Nintendo intended for this, but I think it's actually kind of working in their favor in a really weird way. But a lot of the controversy around the price is actually incredibly good press for them. Like really good, because it's getting the word out that there's a new Switch. Despite it being bad news about price, there's so many people now that know about it because it's getting into mainstream media because of all the stuff going on with tariffs and the launching, and like, so it's like, it's strange how like, yes, people are like, oh, it's gonna be a terrible flop. It's like, actually this could actually backfire on those people and help Nintendo. So I don't know. I still think there's going to be a challenge like moving forward, and I definitely don't think the Switch 2 can meet the same numbers as the Switch 1. But I do think that that's probably the best strategy they have, is just the 2 moniker and just having getting more involved with media. Like, this is the first time I've seen them really invite YouTubers and get them involved in marketing. Like, they usually like don't play. Obviously, they didn't like have one-on-ones with them, but they brought them to an event to try it, and they let them take footage of it, and they, it's like, it was a lot of like big ones. Like, I follow a lot of these tech YouTubers, iJustine, Marquez Brownlee, Austin Evans. I know there was a bunch. Casey Neistat. There was like a bunch of big YouTubers have millions of subscribers that follow it, and of course other tech YouTubers, and maybe it's people just in the tech world, but even like I saw Doug Buzzer had an interview with was it MSNBC? Might have been, I can't remember, but mainstream media. When the Switch 1 launched, the big thing that really like helped a lot, it was they put it on Jimmy Fallon. Like we're just like, yeah, whatever, but like you forget, like that's where all the normies are. They're all watching things like Jimmy Fallon, and obviously it didn't capture everyone, but it was like, that was a big deal to have it like out there in the, not just in the tech channels, like regular people seeing it. They had a Super Bowl commercial for it. They didn't do that this time, but I wouldn't be surprised if their marketing strategy is a little stronger this time too, to get the word out that it's the number 2. They're going to constantly be showing the Joy-Cons getting yoinked off the side to kind of show, like, people will be like, wait, what? That's not, my Switch can't do that. And hopefully that'll get people thinking a little bit too. But at the same time too, I genuinely think this is the whole point of this whole podcast, is that Nintendo they got a ton of inventory, right? They do think it's going to sell like crazy. So in that part, they're not worried, but they're also just not worried about capturing everyone right away. Like, you look at the lineup for this year of Switch 2 games, and it's like a few exclusives, but a lot of them are like remasters and added content and third parties. So I think Nintendo's kind of like, we're going to get this thing out there. We're going to deal with inventory because we got to get people their hands on it. And I think there's going to be another Direct announcing more games too. I still have a hard time believing there's not a 3D Mario. If DK really is taking the place of Mario this year, that's kind of crazy. But there's part of me is like, there's got to be more than just Mario Kart this year. Because
I think what happened.
I was just saying the back end of the year is just kind of empty.
Yeah, so I think what happens with that is I think we get a Mario 40th Direct sometime in September, around the actual anniversary, and that's when they show 3D Mario, and it comes out early next year around the time of the movie.
Is the movie next year?
Yeah, it's in April of next year in 2026.
That's right. It's a Zelda movie,
and so it closes out the financial year, and it honestly like fits perfectly with what they've been doing, and it just makes a ton of sense to me. And then people, you've had a little bit more time, you've had a holiday season for people to get Switch 2s, like it just makes a ton of sense. And I mean, who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe 3D Mario is the holiday game, but I think everything lines up for a big 40th that is capped off with a new 3D Mario. Like, you start it with a new Mario Kart, and you like finish with the new 3D Mario. Mm-hmm. And I think that just makes sense. And then having DK in there, having him look like the movie version, etc., also sort of plays into it in a little bit more tangential of a way, but still at least somewhat relevant.
I really like that. That's a really good point. I hadn't even considered the fact that the Mario movie is coming out April of next year. And yeah, tying those together would be huge. You could sell you just hype people up on Mario if you release the game either before or around the same time. Because, I mean, yeah, I don't know. But that makes me think there's got to be a Mario Direct coming up that's going to also show us the first trailer for that movie. Because if the movie's, I guess it's about a year away from now, but, it's still kind of like, I don't know.
September would be the perfect time.
It would be.
Because like if they're just like, yep, here's, we're gonna end on two things essentially. Here's the trailer for the next Mario movie, and then they show, like Yoshi, and they show whatever, and they end it with like Wario or something like that, like some surprise character that we had no idea
Mm-hmm.
was coming. And then they're like, oh, and by the way, here's one more thing, and they actually show like Super Mario Ultra Adventure or whatever it's going to be called. I don't know. But all joking aside, like it's going to blow our minds. I'm pretty confident. Because
Yeah.
every 3D Mario is honestly like not even trying to rank them. Every new 3D Mario is extremely impressive in and of itself because they aren't just recycling the previous 3D Mario. They're like, we're going to just do something new, regardless of what order you think that they come in terms of quality or appeal or whatever. Like some people, like my wife, love 64. 64 is actually at the bottom for me. I think Odyssey is at the top for me personally. But like, no matter what, it's going to be a great game. Whether it's the best one, worst one, doesn't matter. Like they're all like really close. They're all like 9 out of 10 games. So the difference between them is like, that's why people fight over it, right? If there was a clear difference in quality where it's like, oh, this one's like garbage tier, everyone's going to have that at the bottom. No one's favorite Metroid game is Other M, for example. like seriously, like and granted, Other M, that's a discussion for another time. I actually don't think it's as bad as everyone says it is, but it's certainly not my favorite game.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that fits too well, especially with the games that we already know are supposedly coming out this year. Like, where are they going to cram in 3D Mario? You know what I mean?
It does feel a little crowded because I know that there is the Hyrule Warriors game is going to come out, I believe, later this year. I think Air Riders is coming out later this year. So, and obviously Metroid Prime 4 is probably, I'm going to assume, an October game. So you've still got your September, you've got your November, December games. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot they've got to fit in there. And then, they've got to, who knows what they'll start out next year with. But I think they're also definitely going to push a lot of third-party games. And we saw a lot of third-party games in that direct. And I think there's going to be more coming, especially once they get more dev kits, because it sounds like it's really not that hard to get your game on Switch too, from what a lot of these devs are saying. So I'm very excited to see what they pull off. And, we'll see. I know a lot, it's definitely a strategy that's super macro with Nintendo. They're not looking at things like the way we are with, like, we just think that Nintendo needs to be reactionary to every little thing that gets said and done. They need to come out here and say this. They need to do this and this. And I'm like, no, they don't. They just don't. Like they're looking at this from a completely different vantage point. And obviously if people aren't buying into everything, then they'll have to rethink it. But like at the moment, they're still selling. I mean, people are still going to those parks. And people really underestimate how big of a deal those Nintendo parks are to the overall health of the IP. Mario is bigger than Mickey Mouse. He's bigger than almost any other property out there, except for Pokemon. Like legitimately, Pokemon's like one of the biggest, if not the biggest franchise out there. But Mario and Pokemon go toe to toe.
Yeah, highest grossing media franchise of all time is Pokemon. Second is actually Winnie the Pooh.
Oh, yes.
Which is hilarious. But like all joking aside, like the fact that a guy, I don't know if it's true or not. I assume it's true. The legend is that Mario was based on the likeness of like a landlord or something like that at one point. And I don't know if it's true or not, but if that is true, like that's a pretty great, like that person, if they actually know, is technically the most famous person in the world, technically.
Yeah.
But but I'd actually like to sort of going off of the Nintendo needs to be reactionary or not sort of point. I kind of want to answer my last question in two different ways. So one of them is like what. So essentially, the question was what's different between Wii U transition and Switch 2 transition. This is not the same Nintendo. Like everyone likes to pretend that Nintendo, has essentially like been constant, but it's also not, it's constantly doing new things, like whatever, but they always innovate. This is a different Nintendo than before. They don't have Satoru Iwata at the helm anymore. they've got different leadership. They're trying new things. Like we see game chat's like totally different from what they've done before. They are doing an iterative console, which granted they've done before, but it's like they follow up their biggest success with an iteration on it. Like, okay, which granted 3DS was sort of an iteration on DS, so maybe I've undermined my own point, but I do think that this is actually a different Nintendo. They are expanding, like you said. They've got the theme parks. We've got movies now. Like, this isn't stuff that they did before. In some ways, they're taking risks, but they're sort of diversifying. And yet, with their console, they're sort of doubling down on the same premise. Now, whether or not that suggests that they've got something else that they're working on in the background, as like, oh, this is actually going to be the new thing, but the tech isn't there yet. It's too expensive, or like whatever. Or they're working on something new. Like, who knows? We don't spend hours and hours and hours, every week just sitting down. Our job is not, hey, let's come up with a new console. Our job is like, well, we have our day jobs, and then our hobby is like speculating on what they might do next, not what they have access, what they actually have access to. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But so I think that's one point. And then I think that there's another thing that nobody's talking about, which is that gaming is different now.
Yes.
Gaming is much more accepted. It's been a considerable amount of time. People who grew up playing video games, after video games figured out what they wanted to be, are now adults. You and I are now adults. You have kids. I'm planning to have kids soon. We're in a different space. Gaming looks different. Gaming is more acceptable. And so I think for that reason, it's a different ball game. And I think all of that comes together to suggest that, like probably during the Wii U era, I don't know, like I was already an adult at that time, but during the Wii U era, it wasn't in my mind like, oh yeah, I see this game coming out and I'm definitely buying that. Like it's already not like part of my budget. Obviously I budget other things first, but it's just sort of like a given that my wife and I are like, okay, like, this game's coming out. We're definitely getting this game, whatever. It's more like back then in the Wii U era, it was like, hopefully, I have, money to buy one game. You know what I mean? Like now it's considered more part of our entertainment and almost a thing that we like plan for. They're almost like events. And I suspect that we're not alone in that. And, granted, with something like the vouchers and stuff, that may like lead you to, buy something that you otherwise weren't planning to because, I got an extra voucher or whatever. At the same time, I think that, we're sort of in a different space where we've prioritized gaming a bit differently. And I think, lots of people are doing that. And I think for that reason, like it or not, with how expensive it is, how much of a jump it is, it's still less absolute dollar wise, not even adjusting for inflation, than the PS5 was at launch, unless you get the Mario Kart, bundle.
Mm-hmm.
But just, pure console, whatever, like it still comes in cheaper than that amount, not even adjusting for inflation. And I think for that reason, it's still going to be perceived as the better value for what you're getting. Like if you are trying to make the decision of, do I want to get a PlayStation 5 or do I want to get a Switch 2? Like regardless of if you know which one's newer, which one's not, like you're going to look at the price tag and you'll be like, oh, well, this one's portable and blah, blah, I think it's a different game. Now, I think if Sony, I think if the landscape was different and Sony had, or Xbox or whoever had a handheld that was actually a serious competitor, it might be a different story. But there's nobody really competing in that space except for the Steam Deck, which, as we've covered before on the podcast, has not quite had the market penetration of the Switch, not even close. And, a lot of the people that buy that already had Steam accounts, already had PCs, so they're like a different market entirely. I think it's a different ball game. So those are my two answers to my own question that I at least wanted to touch on and see like what your thoughts were.
Yeah, and with the Steam Deck too, just to touch on that, is, Valve did not market that at all. Like, if only people that know are PC gamers because it's on Steam and they advertise it, or you're just in the know because a lot of PC gamers are in the know. But like, so many people, I mean, it only sold 3 million units and it's been out since 2022. So that's 1 million units a year. Maybe it's sold more since my last check. but it's not exactly like, flying off the shelf because Valve doesn't sell it except for through Steam. And so there's no marketing for it. No parent's going to see it on the shelf. And also there's so many kids. I mean, unless the kid's somewhat tech savvy. I know it's not like, rocket science to use it, but you do have to have a little bit of know-how and stuff because not everything works. There's games that they're a little bit finicky, and you have to tweak settings, or if you have to dial it in. Whereas when you give a kid a Switch and you give him a Switch game, there's no tweaking it. There's just you play it. It just plays how it is. I mean, and I know they've got some new modes now, like performance and quality modes, but like at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which one you pick. The game still runs fine. Like no one's gonna look at 60 frames 4K and be like, "Oh, this game's running like crap."
There will be some.
There'll be some.
Always some.
There'll be someone, but I mean that's such a small minority of people. So yeah, there's just some people that just want something simple and easy to pick up. So, and those people like the Switch, and and I think, you look at like cell phones, right? Cell phones have, iteratively, usually with numbers, people are used to that. Sony, obviously, it's worked great for them having PlayStation 2, 3, 4. It's so easy to know which one they're on. I think that's actually part of the reason why the PSP failed. I mean, it didn't fail. Like the first PSP actually sold decently well. But you actually look at the sales numbers, it did okay. It just was dwarfed by the DS though in numbers. So everyone's like, it failed. But I'm like, no, the PSP didn't fail. It just didn't sell as many as the DS. It sold like, I think it's like, I want to say it's close to 80 million units still. It's still kind of crazy. It's the PS Vita that failed because it had the Wii U problem. No one knew what a PS Vita was. Like, why would you call it PS Vita? Why wouldn't you call it PSP2? Like, obviously, Sony knows that works. That was like the biggest blunder of all time. If they called it PSP2, it probably would have sold a lot better. I'm just being real.
Yeah, so I think, as always, Sony's biggest competitor is itself, or rather, his biggest hindrance is itself.
Yeah,
as always.
So, I mean, I think, there's definitely, and again, at the end of the day, what all this comes down to, whether, we're talking about Switch 1, Switch 2, anything, is the games sell the system. The reason, like, when the PS3 launched, right, it was $600. I remember people just couldn't fathom it. It was like Sony had lost their mind. And the problem is they launched it at that price. And part of the reason it was too is because it was the same strategy as the PS2, where it's like, oh, it's a cheaper Blu-ray player. So even though it's $600, it's still cheaper than a $800 or $1,000 Blu-ray player. But here's the problem: is that it was huge. First off, and for those who want it for gaming, they didn't have any killer apps at the beginning. Like, it took a while for PS3 to get its legs. It eventually did actually do well towards the later part of its life because they came out with the PS3 Slim, and they got the price down, and the way they did that was getting rid of the PS2 hardware that was inside of it. So it was no longer backwards compatible. So that was a huge loss, but, it saved the money. And they had great games. By the end of the PS3's life, it had some insane games, like all the first 3 Uncharted games, and they had, not the new God of War, but it had God of War 3. It had The Last of Us. It had the Ratchet and Clanks. It had Little Big Planet. It had what was some of those? I mean, there's some really phenomenal games.
Well, let's not forget Heavy Rain.
Oh, the system seller right there. No, but it had some phenomenal games by the end of its life, but. Yeah, it had a rough start, and I think Nintendo's actually launching with literally their best game. Like, let's just, we can pretend all we want that people are like, oh, it's too expensive, won't buy it. Like, come on, it's Mario Kart. It is.
Yeah, people are gonna buy it.
People are gonna buy
truly.
it.
And I, again, like, I think I said this in the last podcast. I know we've talked privately. There's a reason that there's a Mario Kart Direct coming up. There's a reason. There's something about it we don't know. The open world's too empty for it. Like Nintendo's not going to launch, like the company that launched Breath of the Wild isn't going to launch Mario Kart with a completely empty open world. Like, there's some function to it. There's some reason that they're doing it.
Yeah, well, there's an interview with Bill Trennan with the Nintendo Treehouse, and he basically was like hinting, like, you need to see the Direct there, and because people are mentioning the open world, like there's a lot more to it than we're led on. They've held back a lot. So I think the open world has a lot more. And I have it's either going to be just super way more missions and adventures, and they could be, I mean, for all we know, they could be boss fights because you can pick up items in the open world. I could see there being full on adventure mode, co-op adventure mode in the open world. That would be insane. But
I'd play the heck out of that.
But what if they went, I mean, I don't think they will, but imagine if they just went ham and said, yeah, it's a Mario Kart MMO.
There's no way, but that would be hilarious.
That would be hilarious. Just cars everywhere.
Blue shells everywhere.
Oh my gosh.
Just rocketing around the planet.
No, but I do think it's going to be like a co-op adventure. The fact that they already announced that you can have multiple people, there's going to be like way more going on. So, and it'll be collectibles, unlockables. I mean, they already showed that they have an insane character roster, but I think they're going to have an insane unlockable roster, like unlocking more cars, unlocking new costumes. I mean, what if they like make it so you unlock certain items? I mean, that probably won't. I don't know, but like, it's like a whole thing that they could. I don't know, and maybe and knowing Nintendo, just like the Donkey Kong game, where no one saw that coming. Same with Mario Kart. I mean, who knows what gimmick they've come up with that we're gonna be like, I didn't know I wanted that, but now I want that.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's still Mario Kart. Like, most people are going to play through the gimmicks, and then they're going to go back to racing like everyone wants to, and it's going to be super fun and amazing, and people pour thousands of hours into it. So,
so connected to Mario Kart, but sort of like a almost change the subject question. When inevitably we get Link added as part of the DLC, do you think it's going to be Tears of the Kingdom Link with like essentially like a construct motorcycle, like an Ultra Hand construct motorcycle?
I mean, I could see that. Yeah, some kind
It'd
of
be kind of funny, I think.
That, or I think they could have like multiple. So they'll have like, if they do bring, because they got all the costumes right, they could bring Link in with multiple cars. So like his Breath of the Wild bike, but also his like a Tears of the Kingdom one. Same, swapping costumes and things like that. But it'd be interesting because the fact that the previous Mario Kart, they did have Link and they had Animal Crossing and Splatoon. They show none of that in this one. And I'm wondering, though, if maybe Nintendo is trying to rein that in a little bit, though, and keep it more Mario focused. So that, because they maybe were worried, like, oh, wait, we're getting a little too bit Smash Brothers here. We kind of want to keep Smash Brothers, and Mario Kart. So that's why they're throwing like everything at it with characters. This definitely feels like a bit of a reset with that game, because they definitely have like removed certain things. I don't think the anti-grav is coming back. They've changed the gliders. There's no underwater anymore. They've changed a lot. So it definitely feels like they've kind of gone back to the roots a little bit and like back to the drawing board. So this definitely isn't like, because Mario Kart 8 just felt like it was stacking, right? We had, Mario Kart Wii, we had brought in bikes, and granted they still have bikes in this one, but then you had Mario Kart 7 with the gliding, Mario Kart 8 with anti-grav, and it's just every single one stacked the features. This one feels like, no, we're taking all that back.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a soft reboot to me.
Yeah, and I think it's good because Mario Kart needed to kind of have a bit of a reset. So, but we're getting a little, we're turning into a Mario Kart podcast episode.
Getting off topic.
One more thing I just was going to bring up, because I forgot I had this in my notes, but as much as people like to believe that every human being out there has bought a Switch 1, there are still people that don't have a Switch. So this goes back to like why people might buy Switch 1 still. And like, I know because my brother is one of them and he listens to this podcast. And I don't think he's going to buy a Switch 1. I think he does want to buy a Switch 2 so he can play Switch 1 and 2 games. But at the end of the day, there's still like loads of people out there that just never bought a Switch 1. And like I said, don't care about the latest graphics, or they're just going to give it to their kids, right? And kids don't care if they have the latest games or not. They'll play. My kids literally don't know that the games they're playing, like the Mario Kart they're playing, is 11 years old. They don't care. It's Mario Kart. It's fun. So they're playing all. I mean, I had my son playing on the Wii U, and he's playing the original Mario Maker. He's playing Nintendo Land. He's playing Pikmin 3, all on the Wii U. Like, he doesn't. I mean, those games still look good. They still play good.
Yeah.
Like, who cares that this system is twice as old as him? I mean,
yeah.
So point being is that it's family is what Nintendo targets, and if parents are looking for a cheap system for their kids, they'll buy them the Switch 1 Lite or whatever for their kids. And if a parent is just loaded and they want to get their kids the very best, they'll get them a Switch 2.
Yeah, I would be really interested in knowing, in addition to just, obviously how many units have sold, the average number of accounts on a Switch. Like, or at least a distribution of that, because I think because like looking at your household, you are a single Switch household for now. My household, fewer people, 2 Switches.
Yeah.
and then soon to be, a Switch 2 as well. And I'm already like thinking, okay, like, at some point in the future, like maybe, obviously much later in the generation, but who knows, maybe my wife would end up with a Switch 2 as well, assuming that there's like a game that sort of demands it or something. But at least for the time being, like, we're only anticipating one, but like, vastly different situations, but the number of people interacting with the Switch in some ways is almost the more important thing than the number of Switches sold themselves, though obviously that's where Nintendo makes their money. But in terms of like how many people, because Nintendo obviously wants long-term customers, they want people who are going to keep coming back for every new device or whatever. Like, you got kids interacting with the Switch, I would imagine they're likely to become Nintendo fans themselves, and like when they're our age eventually, starting their own families, like assuming Nintendo's still around, because my gosh, they're it's older than some countries.
Yeah, people don't realize this. Australia became, its own sovereign nation in 1901, and Nintendo's been around since 1889. So Nintendo is literally older than Australia's like sovereignty.
Which is crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
So yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, but they want repeat customers, and so in some ways, I kind of wish, I get that why Nintendo doesn't release all these stats. It would be fascinating to know the distribution on that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that like because the Switch kind of is both a home console and a Game Boy, and I use Game Boy. Obviously, Nintendo's moved way beyond Game Boy, but I look at it in the same sense of like it's their handheld. So like you do have those people where it's like, yeah, you want to play Pokemon with your friend or in trade and all that stuff. You have to have two systems. And so, yeah, you get that sale, but then you have people like me who's like, I can't afford to buy every single one of my kids. And to be fair, Switch came out before I had kids, so I wasn't really thinking that way. So yeah, it's like, only needed one system. I was the only one playing it. My wife plays it more now because there's a few more games that she likes. And that's another thing, too. My Switch 1's still going to get a ton of use, even when I get the Switch 2, just because now my kids have something they can play with for all the games they love. And then there'll be a few Switch 2 games. Eventually, it'll become the family Switch 2, but, it's going to be mostly mine. And ironically, I'm not going to be playing. I will be buying Mario Kart World, but it probably will not be the first game I'm playing on Switch 2. It's totally going to be Tears of the Kingdom at 60 frames per second. I'm literally holding back from playing that game because I want to, and I want to go back and play it so badly, but I'm like, no, I need to hold out because I want to replay it. Actually, we have a mutual friend of ours who I was talking to recently, and he was saying, yeah, I haven't played Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, and I said, and he's like, he's considering playing it, and I said, you picked the best time to play this because you're going to get the literal best version of these games, like completely. Other than the fact that the Breath of the Wild one doesn't come with DLC, which I think is a big missed opportunity, but Nintendo is not perfect. I'm not going to pretend the whole podcast isn't trying to defend Nintendo. This whole thing was to kind of try and understand their strategy. Whether it works or not is yet to be seen. I do think it is better than the way Microsoft handled with the Xbox One. As much as people are making those comparisons, I think that, Xbox One failed because it had a higher price than PS4. It had way less convincing games to get people to play. It was going to force you to be online all the time. No one wanted Connect, and you play used games. It's just like everything about it just was wrong. And PS4 just came out the gate swinging. So I think that's the only reason why that one failed. I think Nintendo Switch 2 is coming out the gate swinging with Mario Kart. They literally are picking out the biggest hitter of their whole everything. And I think it's going to work out for them. I'm just excited to play it. But yeah, that was our podcast about Switch 1. The Nintendo Switch family of systems, I think, is what I think Nintendo's going with this. Is they're going to keep the Switch 1 around for at least another year, 2 years. Think about the PS2, right? People forget about this. I'm sorry I'm bringing this up again, but like PS2 still was getting games while the PS4 was out. Like, people don't know that.
That's actually kind of nuts.
The PS2 was so insanely popular that they were still supporting it all that time. And I know some people are going to say, well, it's mostly because there were other countries outside of the United States where it took a lot longer for the newer systems to get there. So in a way, that was kind of why the PS2 is still getting games. But the fact that people, companies were still making games for the PS2 despite that, like, it's just crazy. Like, it's a system that just kept getting games for forever and ever and ever and ever. The Wii was kind of that way too, actually, even with obviously because of the Wii U, but like, you still getting Just Dance games even to the Switch life. I think there was some meme. I think I have to look it up, but I could have sworn there was some video where it was like coming to the Nintendo Switch and the Wii. Like, I'm going to look it up after this, but I could have sworn that was the case. It was just the weirdest thing because, yeah, there's still so many people playing that had the Wii. And I think that's kind of what the Switch 1 is going to be like. It's going to be like the Wii, where people are still going to be playing it. They may not know that there's a new system, but they're still playing Switch Sports, or they're playing Animal Crossing, or they're playing whatever. Or they may get into Tomodachi Life. Tomodachi Life is kind of like a very Animal Crossing-esque game. And it sold really well on the 3DS. I didn't realize it sold pretty well on the 3DS, and that's why I think they want to bring it back. But yeah, it's a great game for them to keep the Switch 1 alive for all those people that don't care that there's a Switch 2, can't afford a Switch 2. So, yeah, I love, there's so many people out there who are just constantly harping on how bad everything is with Nintendo and how it's all going to fail. It's all going down, a lot of hyperbole, a lot of clickbait, a lot of clout vampirism.
Yeah, well, and also just recycling like the same debunked information.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah, the thumbnails are debunked, or they're talking about debunked information. It's just very frustrating. Yeah. So get your information from us, Super Dandori Bros. We know it all.
Definitely. That's why we were talking about $90.
Oh, I know, right? Well, I did put a comment on that video to correct that.
Thank you. Thank you. Also, in order to correct another bit of misinformation, I found out you can still download Wii U games, even right now. You cannot buy them, but you can re-download ones that you own.
That's crazy.
Yes. So for anyone who happened to listen to the previous podcast a couple times ago, I can't remember which one it was, that we talked about this, and I was complaining that I don't have access to Xenoblade Chronicles X. Well, joke's on me, I actually do. And so...
Have you downloaded it yet?
No, because I don't have a replacement hard drive or an SD card or anything, but it's only a matter of time. But, in the meantime, for anybody who is like, darn, I don't have access to XYZ game, like, yes, you do. You actually do. Like, if you bought it, you can re-download it still. And Nintendo said for the foreseeable future, they're going to keep it going. So, technically those games are not lost yet. So I stand corrected. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows that.
I'm pretty happy with that information because I was a little nervous. I had an incident where I almost thought I lost all my Wii U games and I was going to have to eat a big humble pie after everything I said. I did manage to get them all back because I have 2 drives that have my Wii U games on them, but I did lose a bit of save data, which sucks. But it is good to know that I can still re-download those games if something really bad happened. And I'm really happy Nintendo's doing that. I know people are mad, but I think it's kind of justified that they shut down the purchasing of games because they're not selling new Wii U's. So like, it's not fair that you're buying these games on a system that you probably, your system's getting old, and I don't know, they're locked to that system, right? They're locked forever. I think it's better that you purchase games while you owned it, you can still get them. I'm really happy Nintendo's offering that service, and they should hopefully support it for as long as they can. But I think what they're doing with the Switch is a lot better as far as it being an account system. The fact that you can play pretty much all those games on Switch 2 is really good. So I think they're moving in a better direction. I hope they move to more of like a Steam direction where like Switch 3 or whatever comes next can also keep playing those games and they keep that ball rolling. But we'll see. I know it was a lot of work for them to get Switch 1 games working on Switch 2, despite the fact that they're using similar ARM-based architecture. Apparently, there's enough differences in the GPU that they had to do a lot of emulation, like basically like not emulation, but it's like a translation layer to get Switch 1 games working on the Switch 2, which I thought was crazy. But that also probably explains why they need certain patches for like some of the free patches they need for certain games to make sure that they work on Switch 2. And part of the reason why they're able to do some of the things they're doing with the upgrade games as well, like with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I think they're actually like recompiled for the Switch 2.
Oh, wow.
But well, we'll see, because I'm curious how that works if you own the Switch, because I have the Switch 1 game, so I'm going to be doing the upgrade, and I'm curious if it's actually patching the Switch 1 cartridge, like it's like a couple gig download, or if I'm literally just downloading, because I have the Switch 1 game, I'm just literally downloading the Switch 2 version onto my system. That's what I'm curious to see, if the upgrade for like Tears of the Kingdom Breath of the Wild is just literally a full game download, or if it's actually a patch.
Yeah, that actually I'm kind of interested to know that too. Which, by the way, I bought Tears of the Kingdom.
Yes, finally.
Yeah, so I finally own it. Finally.
Nice.
It's not as good as the Black Friday deal, but I'm just going to jump on this because I also want to play it again.
Yeah.
But I am also going to wait for Switch 2.
I still have it sitting right next to me, but I'm just like, I'm holding out, because the problem is I could probably beat it before the Switch 2 comes out. And I'm like, but then I won't want to play it again. And I just finished beating Breath of the Wild, so I need to hold off on Tears of the Kingdom, so at least I have one game. And I'll probably try and go for a lot more of the side quests and stuff this time. So, especially with the load times being better, that'd be so much nicer for warping around.
Yeah.
So
much better.
So, well, that's been Super Dandori Bros. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something. And we would love to hear your opinions in the comments, good or bad. I don't care. If you disagree with us vehemently, roast us. Tell us where we're wrong. I just would love to know what your thoughts are on this topic with the Switch 1. I'm indifferent because I'm going to get a Switch 2 and I have a Switch 1, but it's interesting to see what Nintendo's doing. I want Nintendo to succeed as much as people are all ticked off at them. I want them to succeed because I want them to keep making good games. I just hope that, if this is the wrong move for Nintendo, that they will course correct and continue to stay in business.
Yeah.
So
I certainly hope the same. I think I'm optimistic. I think a lot of this controversy blows over. I think they have, all in all, a successful generation. I think we're going to get a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah, I think the future is pretty bright. I think there's some insane games they're probably working on right now that we have no clue. The next Zelda game, the next Mario game, the next Animal Crossing, the next Pikmin, the next Star Fox, please.
The next Pikmin. Yeah. Oh, good. We mentioned Star Fox and Pikmin. Okay.
Oh yeah, we got. I told you we had to get that out of the way. I do hope they bring some of those games to. It'd be weird to have Pikmin on the GameCube Classics thing, and I don't know. I'm really hoping they bring some of the Star Fox ones, like Assault and Adventure. Though that would be fun to actually get to play those finally.
Yeah, that would be great. One thing that I did want to mention, I don't know if I mentioned it last podcast, Kirby and the Forgotten Lands upgrade pack with DLC gives me hope that we might actually get Pikmin 4 expansion. Just a small one.
Yeah, I really hope so. And I do think there's gonna be a lot more expansions. I don't think this is like the only ones. There's no way. I
agree.
They got to, because it's got to take a while for the next Pikmin game, so they got to tide us over with something. But
yeah,
it's Unreal Engine. They could just suddenly bump the graphics up to like to literally Unreal on Pikmin, and
photorealistic Bulbor.
I want some ray traced Pikmin. All right, well, that's it for us. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Leighton, he's Ryan, and we'll talk to you again next time. Bye.
See ya.